Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 152, and today's episode, well, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Machine Head, which is a groundbreaking album from, of course, Deep Purple. Originally released through, I guess, Deep Purple's label, Purple Records, and of course Warner Brothers on March 25th of 1972. So yeah, 50 years. So 50 years, and we're already have been past March 25th anyways, because that was this past Friday. So I think it is definitely a worthy episode anyway, since I've already covered in Deep Purple and Rock, and of course Fireball. Without further ado, let's just dive into Machine Head from Deep Purple. Now, since it's been no secret that, for the most part, Ritchie Blackmore himself was not all that satisfied with the previous album, Fireball. Pretty much felt like that because of the pressure from Warner Brothers, that it felt like a rushed album, that he didn't get enough time to really flesh out a lot of the songs. But with this one, I guess that this to him, I guess in many ways felt a lot more fleshed out, because they actually had some time to really work on this album. This was to him felt like at least a much more proper studio album, and this album was, of course, was recorded from December 6th to at least December 21st of 1971. And of course, though Deep Purple being the main producers, the late Martin Birch was, of course, was the engineer for this album. And that's why I always got and I'll get into more of that. But still, all the recording, for the most part, took place at the Grand Hotel in Montreux, Switzerland, with the Rolling Stones mobile studio. However, I guess that this is going to lead into more of the background and everything for this one, because again, let's definitely I'm just going to read off a little bit off of mostly this page here for at least, for example, Wikipedia. Again, the thing about the... Again, I don't want to feel like I'm reiterating everything, but again, if I'm going to talk about Machine Head, you kind of have to talk about this right here. That's, again, about the whole Montreux Casino, which, again, was the last gig to ever take place here was, again, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. So I'm just going to read off of here. Again, at the time, the group included, of course, singers Flo and Eddie, multi-instrumentalists Ian Underwood, and drummer Ainsley Dunbar. So again, during the show, a member of the audience, I guess, fired a flare into the building's roof, although the audience were initially unaware of the incident because the roof was covered by a false bamboo ceiling. About an hour into the set, people started seeing sparks emerging. The group stopped playing. According to bassist Roger Glover, Zappa, I guess, had said that no one should panic, but fire. After this, the management ordered a controlled evacuation. There were no fatalities, but a group were briefly trapped in the casino's basement before being rescued by Knobs. I don't know what that completely means, but I guess that might be Switzerland's rescue team, I guess, maybe the name for that. I don't know. So shortly after everyone had been safely evacuated, the building went up in flames. Knobs relocated Deep Purple to the Pavilion, a nearby theater, where they recorded the basic tracks for a song provisionally named, titled Number One. Glover recalled waking up one morning saying the title, Smoke on the Water, out loud. From this, Gillan wrote the lyrics, which described the experience in the Montreux A photograph of the burning Montreux Casino was included in the album's gatefold cover. So, again, the pavilion proved to be impactful to record in, as nearby residents complained to the police about the noise, although roadies tried to prevent the police entering by holding the doors shut. The band were quickly evicted. They searched for other recording locations and settled with the empty Grand Hotel on the edge of Montreux. With the mobile unit parked at the main entrance, Deep Purple set up at the end of one of the controls off the main lobby. And, of course, assortment of equipment and sound insinuating mattresses were installed, which meant the band had to walk through bedrooms and across balconies to get to the recording van. This proved as arduous, or Ardos, I guess is what it actually says here. I hope I pronounced all that correctly. That Deep Purple stopped listening to playbacks of the recordings, instead performing until they were satisfied. A closed-circuit television system was set up so the band could communicate with the engineer Martin Birch and slow staff in the studio control room to see. To see them. And again, here's some quotes from Ritchie Blackmore, I guess, about this one. Again, he's according to him, in his thoughts here, we had the Rolling Stones mobile recording unit sitting outside in the snow. Once we got to the truck for our playback, even if we didn't think it was a perfect take, we'd go, yeah, that's good enough, because we just couldn't stand going back again. Now here's, of course, there's a quote from Ian Gillan. I gotta kind of stretch this one out so I can get to it, to this quote here. So here we go. This was from Ian Gillan right here. This was discussing the origins of Smoke on the Water right here. So we were sitting in this bar restaurant about a quarter of a mile from the casino, and it was blazing. The wind was coming down off the mountains and taking the smoke and flames across the lake. So those were all words and everything from both Ritchie Blackmore and Ian Gillan, just about the whole experience of recording Machine Head. So eventually, by, of course, I guess March 25th is when everyone finally got to see the album in stores. Because again, all this is probably why everything was delayed until for the most part, why everything got stretched into December 21st. Basically a whole month of December was basically because of the whole situation surrounding the building and the whole fire, and then of course the whole Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention and all sorts of that, and of course then even the folks complaining about basically their loud music. So it just was it just halted a lot of it, but I think all of these experiences and the whole thing, I felt like why it kind of adds a little bit something to the album. So without further ado, let me just get into the entire track listing for Machine Head, because this album you might as well slap the title Greatest Hits or the very best of Deep Purple, and I think nobody would basically no one will blink an eye, because this really does read like a very best of Deep Purple all on its own. Because I mean, just from beginning with Highway Star into Maybe I'm a Leo to Pictures of Home, Never Before, of course, the aforementioned Smoke on the Water, Lazy, and Space Truckin'. And of course, the whole time length for the sound, of course, again, clocking at 37 minutes and 46 seconds. This is probably the most jam-packed Deep Purple album to begin with. Most of the albums prior to that had some deep cuts on them. For the most part, I mean, they're not really completely talk about the first three from the 60s with, of course, Rod Evans and so on, again, who go on to form Captain Beyond, which would release an album this year in 1972. So that's really interesting, which I'll get to at some point. But the whole record to begin with right here is just this is probably the most where I think there's less deep cuts and just more, just straight up hard hit. I guess basically mainstay hard hits for the most part. Everything is basically a Stone Cold classic from song to song. I know you'll now have people say that there's some songs they don't care for, but if you just look at it just from a singles point of view, this one basically was this had it all. Again, the previous two albums had mostly deep cuts with maybe one or two hits, maybe sleeper hits, mostly if you're looking at Fireball, but this one just had more straight up arena based hits. So this was really from a ground, more of a sales standpoint, from someone who is at least an A&R manager or whatnot. If you're in at least, depending on the record stores, if you're looking at the record sales, this one is definitively the biggest Deep Purple album, just because, again, even just the songs alone, because every one of these songs were a hit. So that's basically all that can be said. I mean, we can look at the charts here again, and of course there's accolades. I mean, in 1989, Kerrang! Magazine had listed this as one of the 100 greatest heavy metal albums of all time. I mean, it was ranked at number 35. And I mean, it is kind of one of those precursors to at least the heavy metal sound in the 80s. I mean, in 2001, even though it's not listing a ranking for this album, but Q Magazine in the UK, because again, this was probably more of a huger hit, or a big hit in the UK, but it did serve as a really good big hit here in the States anyways. But still, Q Magazine had listed this as, I guess, the 50 heaviest albums of all time, which is, I don't know if I could say it's the heaviest, but maybe for 1972 it was probably close to one of it. But I don't know if I could say it's probably by far the heaviest albums of all time. But it is a heavy record in its own right. But I mean, Mojo Magazine in 2001, again at the rank of number 66, ranked as, again, the ultimate CD buyer, I guess, and the ultimate CDs buyer guide for rock. Again, Q Magazine in 2004, with no ranking, listed this as the 30 greatest classic rock albums of ever, basically. And there we go. I actually completely agree with that one for sure. Then Kerrang! Magazine in 2005, ranking at number 34 as one of the 100 best British rock albums ever. Yes, I can definitely agree with that one as well. And of course, Classic Rock Magazine, ranked in 2006, ranked this as number 26 as one of the 100 greatest British rock albums ever. Again, I can't disagree with that one either. The Guardian in 2007, with no ranking, ranked this as the 1,000 albums to hear before you die, and I probably can agree with that one as well. But either way, the magnificence behind this, and here we got the chart, just the overall chart positionings for this album. Again, the Australian album charts ranked this as number one each and wherever from in Denmark to France, Germany, United Kingdom itself, and I guess the Netherlands here, Norway, Austria, Sweden, Japan, Canada, and of course here in the United States, for the most part, from at least it had a high chart rating. Again, just from Australia to the Netherlands, it was positioned at number one, and of course even including in Canada. But in Norway, it was listed as number 3 on their charts. And of course, in Austria, it was, of course, the number 4 highest selling album. And of course, then in Sweden, it was the number 4 highest selling album. Then, of course, in Japan, it was the number 6 highest selling. Here in the US, it was number 7 in the highest charting album. So it just was such a big record for them. And personally, for me, I know you might have felt like I might have just copped out a little bit because I talked a lot more about its overall significance. But now, as someone who spent decades listening to this album. And I'll tell you this, just from a personal standpoint, this was actually the second Deep Purple album I actually ever listened to. Probably the third, maybe. I'll say maybe the third one. Because of when I was really young in the 90s, since I was, maybe 5 years old then at this point. Perpendicular had came out, and of course Abandon had came out. Abandon, of course, being one of the final Deep Purple album with John Lord as a full member of Deep Purple, because he would end up retiring after that album. But I just remember my dad getting those albums and playing those. But at some point in the early 2000s, all I remember one close to nighttime, going up into my parents' bedroom, especially the closet area, there's a box there full of CDs. And in that box full of CDs laid a copy of Machine Head. And the artwork and everything just stood out at me. I was like, I knew it was Deep Purple, but I was like, this is interesting. This is a different Deep Purple album. So I pull the CD out of the box, and I pop it into, it was the PS1, I believe. Because I don't think we had gotten the PS2 yet. This was the PS1. And all I just remember was I popped it in there, because it could play again all the music and everything. I popped it in, pressed play, and the first notes you ever hear is just those beginning intros of Highway Star. And of course, me being somewhat familiar with how Ian Gillan was sounding on albums like Perpendicular and Abandon, this was a whole other sort of side of Ian Gillan that I hadn't heard. And this was before I would start hear, Rob Halford and Judas Priest. And then, of course, even much later on, like King Diamond of Merciful Fate, and of course his solo stuff. And of course, maybe Jeff Tate of Queensryche, or Bruce Dickinson of Iron Maiden. Or even at one point, even David Byrne of Uriah Heep. This was before I really was being a lot more before I would be introduced to just those vocalists who were known for really kind of hitting some of those high notes and everything. Ian Gillan was actually the first one I ever heard really belt out some of these type of almost really high falsetto screams or whatnot. I had never heard anyone belt, especially that high of a register. I hadn't. So as a little kid, this was kind of jaw-breaking in a way. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And I know it's like I was still exposed to stuff like KRZR in Fresno, California, which is playing mostly Metallica and Korn and some of these other very modern sort of rock and metal bands at that time period. But something like this, I hadn't heard anyone with such a high register, because nobody was doing a lot of that unless you found a really good window where you probably would hear something from like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and whatnot, where you actually would hear these really high sort of notes that these guys were reaching at the time period within the 70s or the 80s. So Ian Gillan was one of the first ones I ever heard, and I was so familiar with his more low register and more melodic voice at times. I never got to really hear any of how he was in the 70s until I pulled out the copy from that box of Machine Head on CD. And it just blew me away. And each time I would just still at the time, I guess I must have kept listening, because each time I was going into other songs and it was so different. It was interesting, but at the same time, it also had a very infectious sound. And it really made me it fascinated me about Deep Purple really early on. And of course, hearing this was the first time I was even introduced to the guitar playing of Ritchie Blackmore, because I hadn't yet even been introduced to some of the more Rainbow material, or at least maybe later, like maybe In Rock and Fireball and some of that stuff. But I was just, again, Perpendicular and Abandon were the ones with Steve Morse of the Dixie Dregs on guitar. So Machine Head was the first time I ever heard Ian Gillan sound that way. It was the first time I was ever exposed to the guitar playing of Ritchie Blackmore. So it just was such a interesting experience that it really kind of it opened up a whole new door for me in terms of really checking out more older bands, because it ended up becoming a real fascination, especially as someone who was that young in that period of time. Because again, I was really young. I was close to 6 years old, 7 years, 5 or 6 years old in the early 2000s, and I just didn't. It fascinated me about the older stuff. Because I mean, a lot of the stuff that I was hearing on the radio didn't do a whole lot for me, but the stuff that I was hearing that was in my dad's collection always somewhat fascinated me, just because of, I guess you could say, it was the early sort of window of me being really interested in just musical instruments and so on, and just hearing these different notes being played, and at this level of velocity or speed, and it created a different journey, and I have to thank an album like Machine Head for it, because of this really opened up a whole new door. And then at some point in time, I ended up getting really into bands like AC/DC and Thin Lizzy, and of course Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and so on, and then Slayer, Metallica, and eventually I got into heavier stuff. But Blue Oyster Cult, AC/DC, and Nugent, some of these guys were some of my really early sort of fascination with the 70s stuff, and even at times early 80s stuff. It was that sort of a period. So Deep Purple kind of just belonged in that, and they really were one of those really gateway bands. I'm really kind of what I guess Aurora created a personal preference, what I would be looking for in that sort of time period of the 70s and the 80s. So an album like Machine Head kind of really opened up that doorway, and boy, did that door get wider. But the walkway ends up being more of a corridor that ends up becoming a rabbit hole, and it just went further and further and further. And to this day, I don't know if I'm still able to get out of that corridor, that whole long rabbit hole. So I can't get out of that one. So it's still a journey. But I just have to thank albums like Machine Head to begin with. So there it is. And I can talk about the songs on here, but you know about the album. It is considered a Stone Cold classic for a lot of reasons, and justified reasons. And it is. Everyone knows it. It's a classic record. Every one of you who's right now listening to it knows it's a classic record. So it is easily one of the top best, just straight up hard rock albums of the 1970s, and just in general. Again, if you're just into guitar, if you end up becoming a musician, if you want to learn guitar playing, this is one of those albums I think you kind of have to check out, just because of who's behind the instrument on here. And if you want to take up singing lessons, you might have to do some digging into a guy like Ian Gillan, who was very different for the time period, because no one sounded like an air raid siren in 1972 unless you were hearing like David Byron of Uriah Heep, but he had a very different sort of vibrato to him. He was very different sounding. But again, these are two guys who had a very distinct way of singing that ended up becoming an influence a lot of the 80s metal singers and whatnot. Every one of them. This is just where everything began with this album, and of course bands like Uriah Heep and so on. So everything just began here. So that's all I really can say. And the one thing I do have to really kind of bring up, since I kind of alluded to it again, is I think one of the main reasons why this album is so infectious too is because of who's the engineer on the album, that being Martin Birch, because he really does bring out a lot of the heaviness in some ways. He really knew how the band should sound on record. He knew every bit of what they should sound, how the instruments should be, where it should be at, where it should be placed at. He knew exactly how it was supposed to sound. And I think because of the whole situation and the whole, again, around the whole recording, I think added to the overall charm of the album, because you can feel that kind of energy seeping into these songs, and that overall frenziness, I think, made every bit of this album sound the way that it is, and it came out this way, and it's because of the whole situation, Martin Birch and everything. It just created an album that is basically stand the test of time, and that's where we're at with Machine Head, and basically it's a great way of looking back at it and just celebrate it in this way. So 50 years to an album that basically became one of the pedestals and the templates for more even harder and more heavier stuff down the line. But again, you kind of have to go back and really look at albums like this, because this is where everything begins. Black Sabbath may have brought the broodingness and the heaviness into rock, whereas Deep Purple brought in the frenziness. They brought in more of the drive, more of the energy, the electricity. Of course, AC/DC would bring in more of the electricity. I know that's a little more punny. Still, though, these guys just brought in more of a different sort of energy that really kind of created a whole new different sort of experience. And I guess if you combine the sort of styles of Deep Purple and Black Sabbath, that's what you end up getting on later on in the 1980s. So this is where basically heavy metal basically became was starting to become more and more of a thing because of bands like Deep Purple and Black Sabbath, Uriah Heep, and so on. So there we go. Again, it's a classic album, so I don't really have to reiterate anything else. So if you have any sort of thoughts about Machine Head, whether it be positive or negative, you leave them in the comment section below. But if you've never listened to Machine Head by Deep Purple, well, just like I think, what was it right here, what The Guardian at least had titled for their 1,000 albums list in 2007, it is easily one of those albums you probably have to hear before you die, especially if you're beginning to get in to or at least explore the harder and the more early sort of proto-hard rock and heavy metal sounds of the 1970s. It's one of those albums you have to hear at least before you die. So there we go. Hope all of you enjoyed. This is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.